In the heart of the ancient Mediterranean, there once stood a city that rivaled Rome itself. A city of gold and fire, of traders and warriors, of gods and ghosts. Carthage, mother of Hannibal, queen of the Western Sea, was not simply defeated. She was erased. But what if I told you, she never truly died? Welcome to this immersive journey through the full rise, fall, and eternal legacy of the Carthaginian Empire, told in all its glory, grief, and grandeur. If you're fascinated by forgotten civilizations, hidden histories, and stories written in fire, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below where you're listening from, or tell us which ancient empire you'd like to explore next. Now sit back, take a breath, and let the ruins speak. Carthage awaits. Chapter 1: The Shores of Phoenicia. Long before the red sails of Carthaginian ships pierced the horizon of the western Mediterranean, and centuries before the name Hannibal sent tremors through the spine of Rome, there was Tyre. This ancient city, nestled along the sun-kissed coast of what is now Lebanon, was a jewel of the Phoenician world, a constellation of coastal cities bound not by empire, but by trade, language, and seafaring genius. In the second millennium BCE, when many civilizations clung to rivers and plains, the Phoenicians clung to the sea. With no vast agricultural hinterlands to rely upon, they turned to the waves, mastering shipbuilding, celestial navigation, and the art of negotiation in foreign ports. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, these were cities that pulsed with energy, their harbors crammed with goods from Egypt, Anatolia, and the Aegean. Here, the Phoenicians became the carriers of civilization, their swift ships ferrying not just wares, but ideas, alphabets, and cultures. But for all their prowess, they were not immune to the political earthquakes that shook the Near East. With the rise of the Assyrian war machine, the Phoenician cities came under tribute. Though they maintained a degree of autonomy, their freedom grew increasingly fragile under the demands of empires that had little regard for the subtleties of trade diplomacy. It was in this crucible of ambition and anxiety that the seeds of Carthage were planted. As pressure mounted from the east, some among the Phoenicians looked westward, not in retreat, but in search of new opportunities, fresh markets, and, most importantly, a sanctuary from imperial domination. Colonization, for the Phoenicians, was not a project of conquest but of necessity. They established outposts on Cyprus, Malta, and the North African coast, tiny nodes of influence dotting the shoreline like beads on a merchant's necklace. These colonies, while loyal to their mother cities, were often left to fend for themselves, shaping their own identities in distant lands. Among them rose Carthage. Set on a promontory jutting into the Gulf of Tunis, Carthage was perfectly positioned to watch the sea and control the trade routes that threaded through it. Its natural harbor, sheltered and deep, provided a haven for fleets both merchant and military. The soil inland was fertile, the climate temperate, and the position strategic. Though it began as a modest colony, Carthage's destiny would be anything but humble. From these shores, a new chapter in Mediterranean history was poised to begin. One that would see a commercial republic rise to challenge empires, craft an identity steeped in power and pragmatism, and eventually burn with the tragic brilliance of a fallen star. But that was still far in the future. For now, Carthage was little more than a distant daughter of Tyre, bearing the hopes of exiles and merchants, sailors and settlers. Yet the sea remembered their coming, and the winds whispered promises of empire. From the foam and ambition of a scattered people, a civilization unlike any other would rise. Chapter 2: The Founding of Carthage. In the age when myths mingled with memory and history was etched by the hands of poets as much as scribes, the founding of Carthage is said to have begun not with an army or a king, but with a woman fleeing betrayal and bloodshed. Elissa, later immortalized in Roman lore as Queen Dido, was a princess of Tyre, sister to King Pygmalion. Her tale, preserved through echoes of both history and legend, is one of exile, cunning, and the birth of empire. Pygmalion, greedy and power-hungry, had grown suspicious of his sister's influence and wealth. When he murdered her husband, the high priestess Urbis, Alyssa knew that her life too hung by a thread. With a loyal band of followers and a cache of treasure, she escaped the suffocating intrigue of Tyre and sailed west into the uncertain embrace of the Mediterranean. For days they followed the Phoenician trade winds, past Cyprus, past the Greek islands, hugging the coasts of North Africa, until finally they came to a place the sailors had spoken of only in passing, a high promontory overlooking a vast, natural harbor, with fertile lands beyond and native tribes that were powerful but not yet hostile. Here, she would build anew. But land, even then, came at a price. The local Berber chieftain, impressed but cautious, agreed to give her as much land as could be encompassed by a single bull's hide. It was a riddle, perhaps a challenge, or a joke at her expense. But Alyssa was no ordinary refugee. She had the mind of a ruler and the spirit of a strategist. Taking the hide, she sliced it into thin strips, long and narrow, until she had enough to encircle an entire hilltop overlooking the sea. It would become known as Bursa Hill, and from that clever transaction would rise one of the greatest cities the Mediterranean would ever know, Carthage, new city, in the tongue of its founders, Carthage to the Latin world. The early years of Carthage were those of a frontier colony. Settlers cleared the land, planted olive trees and vines, and constructed homes of stone and timber. Temples to Baal Hammon and Tanit were erected as the old gods of Phoenicia were invited to watch over this new world. The harbor was dredged and expanded, wharves built, and warehouses constructed to hold the goods that would soon flow in and out of the city. With every ship that arrived from Tyre or Sidon, with every caravan from the African interior, Carthage grew stronger. Though Carthage began as a daughter of Tyre, its distance from the Levant and the pressures of self-sufficiency soon gave it a measure of independence. When Tyre came under siege from the Babylonians and later the Persians, Carthage was left to its own devices. It did not falter. On the contrary, it thrived. Unlike other colonies that withered without the support of their mother cities, Carthage embraced its isolation as opportunity. It became a hybrid. A Phoenician soul with an African body, a city born of trade but tempered by the demands of survival in a new and challenging world. Carthage's founding was not merely a settlement. It was a statement of resilience, a declaration that civilization could be replanted in foreign soil and bloom anew. The city was not only a haven for exiles and merchants but soon became a beacon for ambition. Others from across the sea joined Alyssa's people. Traders, artisans, explorers, and mercenaries drawn to the promise of wealth, freedom, and opportunity. With each new arrival, the city swelled in size and significance. Stone replaced timber. Trade routes multiplied. Political institutions began to take shape. The memory of Alyssa would never fade. Though Roman poets like Virgil would later reduce her to a tragic lover in his Aeneid, her people remembered her differently. To them, she was the founder and mother of the city, a woman of intellect and strength who built a citadel from exile. Her death, whether by suicide to avoid remarriage or as an act of sacrifice to secure peace, remains shrouded in ambiguity, but her legend endured in every corner of Carthaginian society. Thus was Carthage born, not from conquest, but from flight, not from victory, but from cleverness. In its founding, it inherited the cunning of its matriarch, the maritime genius of its Phoenician roots, and the adaptive spirit of those who dared to forge a future far from home. The foundations laid by Alyssa's followers would endure for centuries, growing into marble temples and sprawling markets, fortified harbors and blood-soaked battlefields. From the slivers of a bull's hide was carved the footprint of an empire. And on that rocky hill overlooking the sea, with sails catching the wind and ambition kindling in every corner, Carthage opened its eyes to the world. Chapter 3: Empire by Trade. From its earliest breath, Carthage did not grow by the sword, but by the sail. Unlike empires built upon conquest and brute dominion, Carthage's strength flowed not from legions or phalanxes, but from the currents of commerce and the discipline of trade. It was a city born of merchants and navigators, and its empire rose not in blazing conquests across continents, but in the hum of dockside markets, the creak of ship timbers, and the whispers of barter in tongues from every shore. The Mediterranean in the first millennium BCE was not a single, unified world, but a vast mosaic of cultures and city-states, separated by distance and distrust, yet connected by water. The sea, for Carthage, was not a barrier, it was a bridge. Its merchant fleets sailed far and wide, hugging coastlines and island chains, laden with cargoes both common and exotic. Silver ingots from Iberia, timber and resin from Sardinia, gold dust and ivory from the African interior, fine textiles from Egypt, and even tin from the misty Isles of Britannia, these all passed through the hands of Carthaginian traders, enriching their city and expanding its reach. At the heart of this commercial web was the Carthaginian harbor, a marvel of urban planning and economic foresight. The outer harbor, open and expansive, teemed with merchant ships from across the sea. Goods were unloaded onto bustling quays, where warehouses stood shoulder to shoulder like sentinels of prosperity. Just beyond, protected and secreted behind a thick barrier, lay the inner harbor, a fortified military dockyard, circular in design and capable of housing hundreds of warships. At its center stood an island structure that served as the admiralty, from which commanders could observe and direct every vessel, whether merchant or man of war. This harbor was more than infrastructure, it was the beating heart of Carthage's empire. Carthage's trading success was not merely the result of geographic luck. It was the fruit of a shrewd and far-sighted economic policy. The ruling elite understood that to dominate trade was to dominate influence. To this end, Carthage established outposts along key maritime choke points and coastal trading hubs, colonies and way stations from North Africa to southern Spain, from the Balearic Islands to the Atlantic shores of Morocco. These were not colonies in the traditional imperial sense, they were not governed by puppet kings or ruled by force. Rather, they were cooperative extensions of Carthaginian commerce. Refueling stations, trading houses, and diplomatic bridges that formed an invisible empire across the sea. Yet, despite the mercantile nature of this expansion, Carthage was no pacifist. Trade routes required protection, and pirates and rivals were constant threats. From this necessity emerged one of the most powerful navies in antiquity. Its ships, sleek and fast, patrolled the waters with purpose. Merchant convoys traveled under armed escort, and Carthaginian warships kept the sea lanes open with ruthless efficiency. The city's admirals were not just sailors, but strategists, commanders who understood that commerce could not thrive without control of the sea. The Carthaginian merchants themselves became a breed apart, worldly, multilingual, and as skilled in negotiation as in navigation. They traveled not only as traders but as diplomats and explorers. Some reached as far as the British Isles, seeking tin for bronze. Others sailed down the coast of Africa, following the Atlantic swells toward lands unknown. The famed navigator Hannibal, whose voyage was recorded in Greek translation centuries later, led an expedition beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, and journeyed far along the West African coast, describing encounters with strange beasts and burning lands. Though dismissed by some as exaggeration or myth, Hanno's account stands as a testament to Carthage's bold maritime spirit. This expansion of influence through trade was not limited to economic goods. It was a diffusion of culture. Though Phoenician in origin, Carthage began to take on a distinct identity. Its dialect evolved, its architecture blended with African and Iberian forms, and its religious practices adapted to new environments. While still reverent to the gods of Tyre, Carthaginian worship developed its own local flavor. Temples stood not only as places of prayer but as symbols of stability, wealth, and civic pride. The city's coins, bearing images of horses, palm trees, and protective deities, became not just currency, but cultural ambassadors, spreading the image of Carthage wherever they traveled. Internally, the city grew into a metropolis. Its streets were laid with purpose, its aqueducts supplied fresh water, and its markets swarmed with goods and people from every corner of the known world. The upper classes lived in villas adorned with mosaics and courtyards, while artisans and laborers filled the denser quarters of the city. Slaves and freemen, foreigners and natives, coexisted in a complicated but functional urban machine. Carthage was no utopia, its wealth was built on inequality and exploitation. But it was undeniably sophisticated. What made Carthage truly exceptional in this era was its vision. Unlike other ancient powers who sought to expand by planting flags and fortresses, Carthage expanded by planting opportunity. Its empire was not built through the subjugation of peoples, but through the weaving of economic interdependence. It did not require total control of distant lands to bend them to its needs. It merely had to make itself indispensable. It was, in many ways, the precursor of what modern economists might call a commercial empire, where influence, not territory, was the key to supremacy. And yet, as Carthage grew rich and far-reaching, it also grew vulnerable. Rivals took notice. Greeks in Sicily bristled at Carthaginian dominance of the Western Sea. The rising power of Rome, still a republic confined to the Italian peninsula, watched warily as Carthaginian merchants brushed the shores of Etruria. The more tightly Carthage wrapped its fingers around the Mediterranean, the more resistance it would provoke. Trade may have built its empire, but the time would come when trade alone could no longer sustain it. The age of peaceful expansion was waning, and the horizon was darkening with the silhouettes of warships and ambition. But for now, Carthage stood triumphant, its sails everywhere, its name synonymous with wealth, and its heart beating in rhythm with the tides it had come to master. Chapter 4: The Oligarchs and the People. Amid the rising marble facades, sacred temples, and bustling harbors of Carthage, there pulsed an equally complex and evolving political heart. For all its maritime glory and commercial grandeur, Carthage was not governed by kings or pharaohs. It did not kneel to an emperor or rally around a divine monarch. Instead, the city stood as a peculiar kind of republic. Neither fully democratic nor purely aristocratic, but a careful dance between wealth, tradition, and pragmatism. At its core was an oligarchy, a system steered by the few, ruled by the rich, and powered by the silent labor of the many. Power in Carthage resided first and foremost with the Sephites, magistrates whose title meant judges, though their role encompassed far more than jurisprudence. 2 Sephites were elected each year, and they presided not as rulers above the people, but as leading figures within a governing elite. Their authority was real, but limited. They guided policy and foreign affairs, yet always in consultation with the ruling councils. The most powerful of these was the Council of Elders, composed of wealthy aristocrats, often from ancient families whose fortunes were built upon trade, land, or war. These elders wielded immense influence, and behind their robes of civic virtue lay networks of wealth and patronage that shaped the fate of the city. But Carthage was not a static system. Unlike the rigid monarchies of the East or the fragile democracies of the Greek world, its constitution was designed to bend without breaking. Below the Council of Elders was the popular assembly, a body that, at least in theory, represented the voice of the citizenry. This was no mob of slaves or the impoverished. Participation was typically restricted to native Carthaginians of wealth or birth. Yet, despite these limitations, the assembly served as a check on the ruling elite, capable of approving or rejecting major proposals, and even influencing the selection of military leaders. Military command, in fact, was one of the few domains where merit could rise above birth. Carthage, unlike many ancient states, did not maintain a large standing army of its own citizens. Its generals were often chosen for their brilliance rather than their lineage. Many were members of prominent families, yes, but they still had to prove themselves on the field. When successful, their fame could eclipse even that of the Sephites. In times of crisis, the assembly could grant extraordinary powers to a single commander, creating a tension between civic governance and military necessity that would become a recurring theme in Carthaginian history. Still, this system, though aristocratic in nature, had an internal logic that served Carthage well. It balanced competing interests. The merchant class that fueled the economy, the landowners who held sway over Africa's fertile hinterlands, and the military leaders who defended it all. It was a government that prioritized stability and profit, wary of populism but also cautious of tyranny. Over centuries, this model allowed Carthage to flourish without falling prey to the rapid collapses that befell more volatile states. Yet, beneath the polished structure of this republic, deeper currents stirred. As Carthage expanded and its wealth grew, so too did the inequalities that threatened to pull at its seams. The city's prosperity was not evenly shared. The merchant elite built vast estates along the inland valleys of North Africa, manned by slaves and overseen by stewards, while the working classes in the city proper toiled for wages that fluctuated with the whims of trade. The gap between the ruling class and the common Carthaginian widened with each generation. Occasionally, reformers would rise to challenge the status quo, men who spoke of land redistribution, of curbing corruption, of empowering the assembly, but most were silenced, politically exiled, or quietly erased from history. Religion, too, played a subtle but important role in Carthaginian politics. The priesthood held significant social weight, and many of the elite families ensured that their sons occupied prominent roles in the temple hierarchy. This served both to project divine legitimacy and to intertwine political authority with spiritual leadership. Festivals, sacrifices, and temple rituals were as much civic events as they were acts of worship. Decisions of war, alliance, or expansion were often made with reference to omens, oracles, and the favor of the gods. In this way, governance in Carthage was not merely a matter of policy, it was a performance, a sacred theater in which power had to appear ordained, inevitable, and just. But if the system bent, it was also vulnerable to rot. In times of peace and prosperity, the oligarchy maintained a fragile harmony. But when threats mounted, when wars drained the treasury or famine struck the countryside, this balance became harder to maintain. The people, though not often rebellious, grew restless. Mercenaries, who formed the bulk of Carthage's military forces, were loyal only to coin. Generals with charisma could command the affections of the masses and the armies alike. And rival factions within the council plotted and schemed, each hoping to steer the republic toward their own advantage. This would become most apparent in the coming centuries, as Carthage faced existential threats from abroad and internal divisions within. For now, though, the system held firm. The oligarchs governed with the quiet confidence of those who believed their rule was natural. The people, proud and prosperous, accepted their place. And Carthage, serene, structured, and self-assured, believed that its republic was eternal. But history does not smile long on those who mistake endurance for invincibility. Chapter 4: The Oligarchs and the People. Amid the rising marble facades, sacred temples, and bustling harbors of Carthage, there pulsed an equally complex and evolving political heart. For all its maritime glory and commercial grandeur, Carthage was not governed by kings or pharaohs. It did not kneel to an emperor or rally around a divine monarch. Instead, the city stood as a peculiar kind of republic. Neither fully democratic nor purely aristocratic, but a careful dance between wealth, tradition, and pragmatism. At its core was an oligarchy, a system steered by the few, ruled by the rich, and powered by the silent labor of the many. Power in Carthage resided first and foremost with the Sephites, magistrates whose title meant judges, though their role encompassed far more than jurisprudence. 2 Sephites were elected each year, and they presided not as rulers above the people, but as leading figures within a governing elite. Their authority was real, but limited. They guided policy and foreign affairs, yet always in consultation with the ruling councils. The most powerful of these was the Council of Elders, composed of wealthy aristocrats, often from ancient families whose fortunes were built upon trade, land, or war. These elders wielded immense influence, and behind their robes of civic virtue lay networks of wealth and patronage that shaped the fate of the city. But Carthage was not a static system. Unlike the rigid monarchies of the East or the fragile democracies of the Greek world, its constitution was designed to bend without breaking. Below the Council of Elders was the Popular Assembly, a body that, at least in theory, represented the voice of the citizenry. This was no mob of slaves or the impoverished. Participation was typically restricted to native Carthaginians of wealth or birth. Yet, despite these limitations, the assembly served as a check on the ruling elite, capable of approving or rejecting major proposals, and even influencing the selection of military leaders. Military command, in fact, was one of the few domains where merit could rise above birth. Carthage, unlike many ancient states, did not maintain a large standing army of its own citizens. Its generals were often chosen for their brilliance rather than their lineage. Many were members of prominent families, yes, but they still had to prove themselves on the field. When successful, their fame could eclipse even that of the Sephites. In times of crisis, the assembly could grant extraordinary powers to a single commander, creating a tension between civic governance and military necessity that would become a recurring theme in Carthaginian history. Still, this system, though aristocratic in nature, had an internal logic that served Carthage well. It balanced competing interests. The merchant class that fueled the economy, the landowners who held sway over Africa's fertile hinterlands, and the military leaders who defended it all. It was a government that prioritized stability and profit, wary of populism but also cautious of tyranny. Over centuries, this model allowed Carthage to flourish without falling prey to the rapid collapses that befell more volatile states. Yet, beneath the polished structure of this republic, deeper currents stirred. As Carthage expanded and its wealth grew, so too did the inequalities that threatened to pull at its seams. The city's prosperity was not evenly shared. The merchant elite built vast estates along the inland valleys of North Africa, manned by slaves and overseen by stewards, while the working classes in the city proper toiled for wages that fluctuated with the whims of trade. The gap between the ruling class and the common Carthaginian widened with each generation. Occasionally, reformers would rise to challenge the status quo, men who spoke of land redistribution, of curbing corruption, of empowering the assembly, but most were silenced, politically exiled, or quietly erased from history. Religion, too, played a subtle but important role in Carthaginian politics. The priesthood held significant social weight, and many of the elite families ensured that their sons occupied prominent roles in the temple hierarchy. This served both to project divine legitimacy and to intertwine political authority with spiritual leadership. Festivals, sacrifices, and temple rituals were as much civic events as they were acts of worship. Decisions of war, alliance, or expansion were often made with reference to omens, oracles, and the favor of the gods. In this way, governance in Carthage was not merely a matter of policy, it was a performance, a sacred theater in which power had to appear ordained, inevitable, and just. But if the system bent, it was also vulnerable to rot. In times of peace and prosperity, the oligarchy maintained a fragile harmony. But when threats mounted, when wars drained the treasury or famine struck the countryside, this balance became harder to maintain. The people, though not often rebellious, grew restless. Mercenaries, who formed the bulk of Carthage's military forces, were loyal only to coin. Generals with charisma could command the affections of the masses and the armies alike. And rival factions within the council plotted and schemed, each hoping to steer the republic toward their own advantage. This would become most apparent in the coming centuries, as Carthage faced existential threats from abroad and internal divisions within. For now, though, the system held firm. The oligarchs governed with the quiet confidence of those who believed their rule was natural. The people, proud and prosperous, accepted their place. And Carthage, serene, structured, and self-assured, believed that its republic was eternal. But history does not smile long on those who mistake endurance for invincibility. Chapter 5: The Gods of Carthage. Long before Carthaginian legions marched or fleets spread their black sails across the sea, long before the name of Hannibal echoed through the hills of Italy, there were the gods. They watched over the city from the high places and sacred precincts, their presence woven into the rhythms of daily life and the grand rituals of state. To understand Carthage, its soul, its fears, its strange blend of grandeur and ruthlessness, one must first descend into its temples, listen to the chants rising with the incense smoke, and witness the offerings laid before the altars. For Carthage was not merely a city of merchants and warriors. It was a city of devotion, where the divine was never far from the affairs of men. The Carthaginian pantheon was inherited from Phoenicia, a cultural lineage that stretched back into the shadowy centuries of the Bronze Age. But while the names remained familiar, the meanings evolved in this new land. The chief deity of Carthage was Baal-Hamon, the lord of storms and fertility, whose graven image often depicted him seated upon a throne, his right hand raised in solemn benediction, a crown of horns upon his head. He was a god of power, not tenderness, a bringer of rain and prosperity, but also a punisher of negligence, a judge of nations. He ruled not from heaven, but from fire, and his favor had to be earned, not presumed. Beside Baal-Hamon stood Tanit, the celestial goddess, often symbolized by a triangle and a disk, a sign whose simplicity belied its sacred weight. Tanit was the protector of the city, the mother of the people, the light in the darkness. Yet she too, like her consort, could be stern. In a society that saw the world as fragile and the future uncertain, their gods reflected the dual nature of existence, generative, yet destructive, generous, yet exacting. Sacrifice was not merely ritual. It was necessity. Religious life in Carthage permeated every level of society. Temples towered over the markets, and small household shrines nestled in the corners of homes. Before voyages, captains made offerings for calm seas. Before harvest, farmers knelt in dusty fields to pray for rain. In times of war, generals implored the gods to guide their swords. But above all, the relationship between Carthaginians and their deities was transactional. It was an exchange. Favors for devotion, safety for sacrifice, prosperity for piety. The gods were powerful, but they were not blind. They demanded tribute, and at times, that tribute came in forms that would haunt the imaginations of later civilizations. Central to this dark mystery was the Tophet, a sacred precinct found near the edge of the city, often described by Greek and Roman chroniclers with a shudder of horror. Here, rows of urns were buried, each containing the charred remains of infants or small animals, often with inscriptions dedicating them to Baal-Hamon or Tanit. To the Romans, this was evidence of child sacrifice, a barbaric rite that became one of the central accusations in their demonization of Carthage. Greek writers, too, spoke of the Carthaginians burning their sons and daughters to appease the gods during times of crisis, especially in war or famine. Modern historians and archaeologists remain divided. Some argue that these were indeed sacrificial victims, part of a religious tradition that saw the offering of a firstborn child as the ultimate act of devotion. Others suggest they were simply cemeteries for stillborn or deceased infants, common in ancient societies where child mortality was high. But the inscriptions complicate this theory, as many explicitly speak of vows fulfilled, of gifts given. Whether literal or symbolic, whether rare or common, the belief in such sacrifice became one of the most enduring, and damning, legacies of Carthaginian religion. Yet it would be a mistake to see the religious life of Carthage only through the lens of fire and ash. There was beauty, too. The temples of Tanit were adorned with delicate carvings and frescoes. Pilgrims brought offerings of olive oil, wine, and incense. Musicians played lutes and flutes during festivals, and dancers moved in rhythm to ancient hymns under the stars. Sacred festivals marked the cycles of the year, planting, harvest, the rising of stars, all woven into the agricultural and maritime lifeblood of the city. Religion was not a separate domain, but the connective tissue of Carthaginian identity. It united the distant colonies and the city's diverse population. It sanctified war and trade alike. Priests held considerable influence, serving as both spiritual leaders and political advisors. Many came from noble families and served as the intermediaries between the gods and the state. Their roles were not confined to temples, they presided over treaties, supervised oaths, and even interpreted the will of the gods through omens and portents. In matters of governance and warfare, no decision was taken lightly without consulting the divine. And yet, as Carthage grew more powerful, its gods grew more demanding. Or perhaps, the city's leaders made them so. When fortunes faltered, when war dragged on, when crops failed or enemies encroached, it was often said that the gods were displeased. And in those moments, the altars burned more fiercely. The line between devotion and desperation blurred. The rites became darker, the sacrifices greater. It was not cruelty that drove these rituals, but fear. A fear born of a worldview that saw life as uncertain, the gods as moody patrons, and the future as a bargain to be struck in blood and ash. In Carthage, faith was not consolation. It was contract. And so, with temples rising beside granaries, with priests whispering beside generals, and with gods dwelling in both hope and dread, Carthage marched onward, rich, pious, and ever watchful of the divine silence that could, at any moment, become divine wrath. The gods were always watching, and in their shadows, history was being written. Chapter 6, Masters of the Sea. To rule the sea is to rule the world. This was a truth understood not only by the Greeks and the Romans, but long before them, by the Carthaginians, those children of Tyre who had inherited the salt-stung ambition of their Phoenician ancestors. In an age when overland travel was slow, dangerous, and bound by the limitations of terrain, the Mediterranean offered a path to power far swifter and more open than any chariot road or desert caravan. And Carthage, seated like a jewel along the curve of North Africa, was destined to become the unrivaled mistress of this inland sea. The city's rise to maritime dominance did not happen by chance. It was calculated, cultivated, and relentlessly expanded. From the earliest days of its existence, Carthage had invested not merely in trade, but in the infrastructure of naval supremacy. Its harbors were among the finest in the ancient world. The natural bay on which the city was founded was deep and well protected, but the Carthaginians were not content with geography alone. They engineered their ports to surpass nature. Constructing an outer harbor for commercial activity and, hidden behind a narrow, fortified entrance, a vast inner military harbor that would become the pride of Punic civilization. This inner harbor, known as the Carthage, was a circular marvel of stone and symmetry. Docks radiated like spokes from its center, each capable of housing a warship. In the middle stood an island command center with viewing towers from which admirals could oversee every ship in port. At full capacity, the Carthage could accommodate over 200 vessels. It was more than a naval base, it was an engine of control, a statement to friend and foe alike that Carthage was not merely a trader of goods, but a master of war at sea. Carthaginian shipbuilding was among the most advanced in the world. Drawing from Phoenician expertise and adapting it to their growing military needs, the Carthaginians developed fleets of biremes and triremes. Sleek, oared galleys designed for speed and maneuverability. Later, they would adopt the larger quadriremes and quinquiremes, which carried more soldiers and ramming power. These ships were not only crafted with precision, but in numbers vast enough to overwhelm their rivals. In time, Carthage would field one of the largest navies the Mediterranean had ever seen. But mastery of the sea required more than ships. It demanded sailors, captains, navigators, and a deep understanding of wind, current, and coast. The Carthaginians trained entire generations in the arts of seamanship. Their navigators learned to read the stars and predict weather from the color of the sky or the behavior of birds. Their captains were seasoned through long voyages to Iberia, Sicily, Sardinia, and beyond. Merchant vessels were often escorted by warships, and even civilian mariners were expected to know the basics of naval combat. Carthage's navy was not a tool of conquest in the Roman sense. Rather than projecting force inland, it was designed to secure sea lanes, protect commerce, and intimidate rivals. Carthaginian power radiated outward in concentric circles from the coast, tied not to control of territory but to control of movement. Theirs was an empire of ports and points, not provinces. a thalassocracy, in the truest sense of the word. To the west, Carthaginian vessels pushed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the straits we now call Gibraltar, and into the Atlantic. There, they established outposts along the Moroccan coast and conducted trade with native tribes. The navigator Hanno the Explorer led one of the most famous of these expeditions, sailing along the western coast of Africa, founding colonies, and leaving behind stone inscriptions that puzzled future generations. His fleet, according to ancient accounts, ventured hundreds of miles into uncharted waters, observing volcanic mountains and strange creatures that some believe were gorillas. Though the precise details remain shrouded in time, Hanno's journey symbolized the boundless ambition of Carthage's maritime heart. To the north and east, the city extended its influence across Sardinia, Corsica, and the Balearic Islands. These were not lands easily taken, for they were already inhabited by fiercely independent tribes and eyed by Greek settlers. Yet the Carthaginians did not simply conquer, they negotiated, traded, bribed, and when necessary, fought. Over time, their flags flew from strongholds across the western Mediterranean, their coins passed from hand to hand in foreign markets, and their language echoed in port cities where once only native dialects had been heard. The greatest challenge to Carthaginian naval supremacy came from the east, in the form of the Greek city-states, particularly Syracuse in Sicily and Massalia, modern-day Marseille, in Gaul. These cities too had ambitions of maritime power. Their fleets clashed with those of Carthage in fierce naval battles that tested the limits of tactics and technology. In Sicily especially, the struggle for control of the central Mediterranean became a brutal and prolonged conflict that would shape Carthage's future in profound ways. Still, even in war, the Carthaginian navy proved formidable. They developed techniques for boarding enemy vessels, using grappling hooks and marine contingents trained to fight on deck as well as at sea. They employed deceptive tactics, feigned retreats, ambushes in narrow straits, night raids on enemy harbors. And above all, they possessed what every great naval power requires, the ability to rebuild. Even when ships were lost in battle or to storm, the shipyards of Carthage worked day and night to replenish the fleet. Timber flowed from Africa, metal from Iberia, manpower from across the empire's vast mercantile web. And yet, for all their strength, the sea carried with it not just trade and victory, but risk. The dependence on naval power made Carthage vulnerable to sudden shifts. Alliances turning, storms scattering fleets, rival cities rising. The sea, though mastered, could never be owned entirely. It was a highway, but it was also a battlefield, and it would soon become the theater of Carthage's greatest conflicts. For now, however, Carthage reigned supreme. Its navy cast a long shadow across the waters, its banners fluttered on every breeze, and its ships moved like currents themselves, inevitable, unstoppable, and laden not just with goods, but with ambition. The city had become more than a colony. It was the mistress of the Western Sea, a power built not on inland conquest but oceanic dominion. And in the age to come, that mastery would be tested as never before. Chapter 7, Sardinia and Corsica. As Carthage matured from a bustling merchant city into a maritime empire, the pursuit of security and dominance drew its gaze toward the islands that dotted the western Mediterranean. Of these, two loomed largest, Sardinia and Corsica. Massive, forested, and rich in resources, these islands were not only valuable in themselves, they were vital stepping stones between North Africa and the trade routes that extended into the western seas. But more than that, they were contested spaces, theaters of competition between Carthage and its rivals, particularly the Greeks and Etruscans. Control of these islands would mean control of a corridor that connected Africa to Europe and Gaul to Italy. And in Carthage's careful calculation of empire, geography was everything. Sardinia, the larger and more rugged of the two, presented both opportunity and challenge. It was a land of mountainous interiors and fertile coastal plains, inhabited by fiercely independent tribes known collectively as the Nuragic peoples, descendants of an ancient civilization that had built stone towers called nurigs, megalithic structures still standing silent watch over the island's windswept hills. These tribes were warriors and pastoralists, deeply attached to their autonomy and deeply suspicious of foreign presence. But the riches of Sardinia, its silver, copper, and timber, were too tempting to ignore. At first, Carthage did not seek outright conquest. Its initial presence on the island was economic: coastal trading posts, garrisons, and ports that facilitated the exchange of African and Punic goods for native wares. Carthaginian merchants brought olive oil, fine pottery, and wine. In return, they received raw metals and grain. But peaceful coexistence proved a temporary illusion. As Carthage extended its reach, it also demanded more control, over harbors, over trade routes, over territory. Tensions with the native Sardinians turned to skirmishes, and then to war. Carthaginian military expeditions began to carve out stronger footholds, especially along the southern and western coasts of the island. Cities were founded or absorbed into the Carthaginian sphere, such as Sulci and Theros, each becoming miniature versions of the mother city, complete with temples to Tanit and Baal Hammon, markets lined with Punic architecture, and walls that spoke of a permanence not lost on the locals. But the interior of Sardinia remained unconquered, a wild heart where tribal resistance persisted for centuries. Carthaginian commanders who dared to march inland found themselves harried by ambushes, their columns picked apart in ravines and forests. The campaign for Sardinia became a long, grinding effort, more draining than glorious, yet essential to the empire's western flank. Corsica, by contrast, was smaller and less developed, but no less contested. Its rocky coastlines and dense forests made it a haven for pirates and a nuisance for any power hoping to control the Tyrrhenian Sea. Carthage, recognizing its strategic significance, established settlements along the southern coasts, particularly around Illyria and Mariana. These outposts were designed less as centers of colonization and more as surveillance points, eyes and ears over the northern maritime passageways. Yet Corsica, too, was a land that did not yield easily. Its native peoples, loosely organized into clans and mountain communities, resisted Carthaginian incursions with the same tenacity as their Sardinian neighbors. Control over Corsica fluctuated over the centuries, often depending on the strength of Carthage's naval presence. During times of war elsewhere, the island would slip into rebellion or fall under the influence of Etruscan or Greek competitors. During times of peace, Carthage would reassert itself, rebuild its garrisons, and renew its tribute demands. But these were not merely isolated conflicts. The campaigns in Sardinia and Corsica were deeply entangled in the wider geopolitical struggles of the Mediterranean. Greek expansion into the Western Sea, particularly from colonies like Massalia, modern-day Marseille, and Syracuse in Sicily, threatened Carthaginian supremacy. Meanwhile, the Etruscans of northern Italy, themselves seafarers and traders, sought influence over Corsica and the northern coasts. These rivalries transformed the islands into battlegrounds by proxy, chess pieces in a larger game of maritime dominance. Carthage, however, proved adept at playing that game. When force failed, they employed diplomacy. When diplomacy faltered, they resorted to subterfuge. Treaties were signed with certain tribes in Sardinia, offering protection in exchange for alliance. Trade incentives were dangled before coastal chiefs, who found in Carthaginian patronage both wealth and prestige. In time, even some of the local populations began to adopt Punic customs, dress, and language, slowly blending into the cultural orbit of Carthage. Militarily, these islands also served as vital bases. They were staging grounds for campaigns into Italy, platforms from which fleets could intercept enemy shipping, and buffer zones that protected the North African heartland from sudden assault. The fortifications erected on Sardinia's coasts, the granaries stocked with African grain, the temples built in Punic style, all were signs of Carthage's intent to remain. And while it never fully conquered every inch of these islands, it held them tightly enough to turn them into bastions of its empire. But this expansion came at a cost. The perpetual wars in Sardinia drained resources and tested the loyalty of the mercenary armies that Carthage relied upon. The dependency on coastal domination left inland territories in a state of unresolved tension. And, more ominously, the efforts to maintain control over Sardinia and Corsica began to draw the attention of another rising power across the sea, a city built on 7 hills, whose people watched Carthaginian movements with growing suspicion. Rome. For now, however, Carthage could claim the upper hand. It had embedded itself into the fabric of the western Mediterranean. Its ships patrolled the waters, its traders set up stalls in every coastal market, and its temples cast long shadows over foreign lands. Sardinia and Corsica were not wholly tamed, but they were under Carthage's spell, a spell woven from ships and silver, spears and sacrifice. And so, from these islands, Carthage continued to build. Not just an empire of ports, but an empire of presence. A maritime web that stretched farther and farther, connecting coasts, peoples, and ambitions under the steady, watchful eye of the city by the sea. Chapter 8: The Struggle for Sicily. Of all the territories that Carthage sought to dominate, none proved as persistently troublesome, as bitterly contested, or as consequential as the island of Sicily. It was here, on this rugged jewel of land set squarely in the center of the Mediterranean, that Carthage met its greatest rival, not in distant Iberia or among tribal insurgents, but in the form of the Greek world. For centuries, Sicily would become a crucible of conflict, a theater where East and West, Semitic and Hellenic, Phoenician discipline and Greek defiance would collide in wave after wave of war. Carthage had known war before, but in Sicily, war became a way of life. The island of Sicily had always been a land of strategic seduction. Fertile valleys, abundant rivers, and natural harbors made it a coveted prize for any maritime power. Its location made it a natural pivot point for control over the central Mediterranean. Whoever held Sicily could disrupt trade between Africa and Italy, or between the Western Sea and the Aegean. And long before the arrival of Greek colonists, Carthage had already laid claim to portions of its western coast, inheriting from earlier Phoenician settlers a chain of port cities that anchored Punic presence, most notably Motia, Panormus, modern-day Palermo, and Solus. But beginning in the 8th century BCE, waves of Greek settlers, driven by population pressure and a thirst for new land, began to colonize the eastern and southern parts of the island. They founded powerful cities. Syracuse, Acragas, Gela, and Selinus, each a miniature polis with ambitions far outstripping their humble beginnings. These cities did not merely grow, they flourished, becoming centers of learning, architecture, and military innovation. Inevitably, they expanded, and as they did, their horizons collided with Carthage's. Tension simmered for decades before erupting into open war. The Greeks, full of pride in their autonomy and art, viewed the Carthaginians as calculating interlopers. Foreign, exotic, and mercantile to a fault. The Carthaginians, for their part, regarded the Greeks as arrogant, unreliable, and too eager to provoke. But beyond ideology and culture, the conflict was driven by hard reality: both civilizations could not share the same island. Their settlements pressed ever closer, their alliances grew ever more entangled, and eventually, they could no longer avoid the inevitable. The first major confrontation came in the late 6th century BCE, but it was during the 5th century that war engulfed Sicily in earnest. Carthage sent massive expeditionary forces to the island, led by generals like Hamilcar and Hannibal Mago. The latter, not to be confused with the more famous Hannibal of later generations, was a scion of the powerful Maganid family. These early campaigns were devastating. In 409 BCE, Carthaginian forces captured Selinus, leveling its temples and slaughtering its defenders. Shortly thereafter, they turned their attention to Himera, where tens of thousands were reportedly killed or enslaved. The message was clear: Carthage was no longer content with containment, it sought supremacy. But the Greeks of Sicily, and especially the city of Syracuse, were not easily broken. Syracuse emerged as the linchpin of Greek resistance. Under the leadership of tyrants such as Dionysius the Elder, the city fortified itself with colossal walls, invested in advanced war machines, and fielded one of the most formidable armies in the Mediterranean. Repeated Carthaginian attempts to take Syracuse ended in bitter failure. In one infamous campaign, the Carthaginian army was decimated by plague while besieging the city, a disaster that forced a humiliating retreat and momentarily checked Carthage's ambitions. The war for Sicily would drag on for over a century, a grinding series of sieges, alliances, betrayals, and counterattacks. The terrain itself conspired against easy victory. The central spine of mountains, the patchwork of city-states, and the fragmented loyalties of native Sicilian tribes made it a battlefield of perpetual uncertainty. Control of the island shifted constantly. One year Carthage would dominate the west, the next year Syracuse would rally the east and push them back. Fortresses were razed and rebuilt, treaties were made and broken, and the population suffered endlessly beneath the weight of foreign ambitions. For Carthage, Sicily was more than a military objective. It was an ideological struggle, a contest to maintain its identity as the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. Losing Sicily would mean exposing its heartland in Africa to new threats. Gaining it would secure its flank and assert its primacy over both Greek and Italian rivals. The repeated investment of vast armies and fortunes into the Sicilian conflict was not blind obsession. It was cold logic, an understanding that without control of Sicily, Carthage would forever be vulnerable. The cost of this strategy, however, was immense. Carthage's reliance on mercenaries, Libyans, Iberians, Numidians, and Gauls, meant that its wars in Sicily often depended on the loyalty of men who fought for pay, not patriotism. Commanders were sometimes brilliant, but many others proved indecisive or overly cautious. Meanwhile, the Greek cities occasionally united under charismatic leaders, tipping the balance against Carthaginian designs. And through it all, Sicily bled. Carthage built massive siege engines, dug elaborate trench works, and even introduced naval innovations to support amphibious landings. The island became a laboratory of war, a precursor to the even greater struggles that would come later. Yet despite decades of conflict, neither side could achieve a final, decisive victory. Sicily remained a fractured landscape, its people caught between rival powers that each claimed to bring order, yet delivered only prolonged devastation. Still, Carthage endured. Though its grip on the island was never absolute, it retained enough territory, enough fortresses, and enough influence to remain a dominant force. It weathered defeats, reorganized its armies, rebuilt its fleets, and returned again and again to the fight. The Sicilian Wars became a proving ground for Carthaginian leadership, and a crucible in which its military doctrine was sharpened. But perhaps most significantly, it was in Sicily that the seeds of Carthage's eventual collision with Rome were first sown. The Greeks of Sicily, beset on both sides, would in time reach out to new allies. And the Romans, ever hungry, ever watchful, would one day cross the sea to stake their claim. The struggle for Sicily was not merely a war for an island. It was the prelude to a far greater drama, the clash of titans that would one day shake the Mediterranean to its foundations. Chapter 9, Iberia, the Silver Frontier. If Sicily was the crucible of Carthaginian conflict, then Iberia was its anvil of wealth. For in the far western reaches of the Mediterranean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules and into the rolling hills and river-fed valleys of the Iberian Peninsula, Carthage found something it prized even more than conquest: resources. The land, known to them as Hispania, was vast, wild, and rich in the very lifeblood of empire: silver, copper, gold, and iron. To a civilization that lived by trade, fought by coin, and paid its armies in precious metal, Iberia was not merely a territory. It was a necessity. And so, in the generations following their repeated wars in Sicily, Carthage turned its eyes westward, toward a new frontier. The initial Carthaginian presence in Iberia was economic, not militaristic. The region had long been known to Phoenician merchants, who had founded ports along the southern coast centuries before Carthage had ever risen to power. Cities like Gator, modern-day Cadiz, had been trading hubs, where metals were exchanged for fine goods from the Levant and North Africa. But what began as trade evolved, slowly, then rapidly, into occupation, and then dominion. The mines of southern Iberia were among the richest in the known world. Vast seams of silver ran through the earth like rivers waiting to be drawn, and Carthage, understanding the importance of monetary strength, moved to seize and protect them. Unlike the piecemeal colonization of Sardinia or the hard-fought conflict of Sicily, the expansion into Iberia bore the hallmarks of careful strategy. Carthaginian generals, often chosen from the city's most ambitious and resourceful families, were dispatched to oversee operations. They negotiated with tribal leaders, offering gifts, trade, and protection. Where diplomacy failed, they deployed force, subduing resistance with hired mercenaries and Numidian cavalry. Over time, outposts were established, fortresses raised, and new cities founded to administer the growing network of Carthaginian influence. Chief among them was the glittering jewel of this new dominion, Carthago Nova, or New Carthage. Founded by the great general Hasdrubal the Fair, Carthago Nova was more than a military headquarters, it was the future. Situated on a natural harbor along the southeastern coast, the city was designed to mirror the mother city of Carthage itself. Wide avenues, strong walls, well-ordered markets, and temples dedicated to the Punic gods. Nearby mines supplied a torrent of silver, and the city soon became the logistical heart of Carthaginian Iberia. From its harbors sailed fleets of ore-laden ships bound for North Africa, Sicily, and beyond. Its vaults filled with the wealth of the earth, and its forges beat swords and armor for armies yet to be raised. But Iberia was not simply a mine to be stripped. It was also a school of war. The Carthaginians, experienced as they were in diplomacy and naval supremacy, now found themselves engaged in constant land warfare against a mosaic of Iberian tribes, each with its own language, customs, and form of resistance. These tribes were not unified, but they were tenacious, and they fought with guerrilla tactics unfamiliar to the disciplined forces of the Punic world. Over time, Carthaginian generals learned to adapt. They employed swift-moving cavalry, scouted with native guides, and recruited entire regiments of Iberian warriors into their own forces. In doing so, they did not merely conquer Iberia, they began to absorb it. This fusion of Carthaginian and Iberian cultures would become a defining feature of Punic power in the western Mediterranean. Iberian hill forts stood beside Punic cities, Punic inscriptions mingled with native symbols. Carthaginian coinage began to depict local motifs. Iberian warriors, with their curved falcata swords and painted shields, marched under Carthaginian banners. Some were conscripts, others allies, but many would become devoted to their new overlords, especially when treated with respect or given a stake in the empire's success. The man who would embody this transformation, who would take Iberia's wealth and warriors and turn them into the foundation of Carthage's greatest military gamble, was Hamilcar Barca. A brilliant commander and statesman, Hamilcar had seen Carthage humiliated in the First Punic War, a conflict with Rome that ended in bitter defeat and a loss of Sicily. But he was not broken. Instead, he looked to Iberia as the source of Carthage's revival. Appointed to lead the expansion of Punic power in the region, Hamilcar did more than conquer. He built. He forged alliances, trained new armies, and established administrative systems to ensure the flow of tribute and resources. His leadership turned Iberia into a Punic heartland in exile, a base from which to rebuild strength and prepare for the reckoning that he knew, one day, must come. Under Hamilcar's rule, Iberia became more than a frontier, it became a crucible for the future. And upon his death, that legacy passed to his sons. Chief among them was a boy who had been raised in the camps of Iberia, trained from childhood in warfare, and sworn to eternal enmity against Rome. His name was Hannibal. Thus, Carthage's dominion over Iberia was not merely one of wealth or territory, it was the foundation of vengeance. The silver mine in Iberia would finance the most audacious campaign in ancient history. The warriors raised in Iberia would cross the Alps in defiance of Rome. The dream that was born in the salt air of the Punic harbors would be reborn in the rocky soil of Hispania. Carthage had come to Iberia in search of resources. But what it found was destiny. Chapter 10. The Rise of Hannibal. Out of the bloodied soil of Iberia, amid the clang of swords and the thunder of hooves, rose a figure who would not only define Carthage's fate but carve his name into the bedrock of world history. He was a general, a statesman, a symbol, a man forged in the crucible of his father's ambition and the hatred of an enemy he had never yet seen. His name was Hannibal Barca, and with him, the course of the ancient world would veer toward cataclysm. Hannibal's rise did not begin in Carthage, but in the rugged hills and storm-swept plains of Iberia, where his father, Hamilcar Barca, had laid the foundations of a new Carthaginian order. From a young age, Hannibal was immersed in a world of military campaigns, tribal diplomacy, and logistical mastery. His earliest memories were not of temples and tutors, but of map rooms, cavalry drills, and the glint of Iberian blades. It was here, in the aftermath of Carthage's defeat in the First Punic War, that Hamilcar instilled in his son a vision, not merely of vengeance, but of revival. According to later Roman historians, whose accounts, though colored by bias, carry a trace of truth, Hannibal, as a boy, was made to swear a sacred oath before his father. An oath that he would never be a friend to Rome. Whether this moment occurred exactly as described or was later embellished is of little consequence. What matters is the psychological inheritance. Hannibal grew not merely as a soldier but as a symbol of resolve. He did not inherit an empire, he inherited a mission. When Hamilcar fell in battle, drowned in the rapid currents of a Spanish river while trying to subdue a rebellious tribe, the torch passed first to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, and eventually to Hannibal himself. By the time Hannibal took command of the Carthaginian forces in Iberia around 221 BCE, he was still a young man, likely in his mid-20s. But his youth masked an intellect and charisma far beyond his years. Fluent in multiple languages, trained in Punic, Iberian, and Hellenic military strategies, Hannibal possessed a mind that combined ruthless pragmatism with dazzling creativity. His first years in command were spent consolidating Carthage's hold over Iberia. He led daring raids into the interior, subdued hostile tribes, and secured the loyalty of others with a mixture of tribute, intermarriage, and calculated generosity. He expanded and improved the fortifications at Carthago Nova, oversaw the minting of new coinage, and began to raise an army that was both multi-ethnic and unified under his iron will. Iberians, Libyans, Gauls, Numidians, all were drawn into his orbit, not by coercion alone, but by a belief in his cause. And it was here that Hannibal's genius began to emerge. Unlike many commanders of antiquity who ruled by fear or divine pretension, Hannibal led from the front. He shared the hardships of his soldiers. He marched with them, ate their rations, crossed rivers by their side. His presence inspired devotion bordering on fanaticism. Men followed him not just because he was their commander, but because he was their champion, a leader who never asked of his men what he would not endure himself. Yet Hannibal was not blind to the larger game. He knew that Carthage's defeat in the First Punic War had not been merely military. It had been economic, diplomatic, and psychological. Rome had outlasted Carthage not just on the battlefield but in the realm of resolve. To defeat Rome, Hannibal would need more than battlefield victories. He would need to shake Rome's very foundations, to pierce its aura of invincibility, to fracture its alliances and break its confidence. He would need, in essence, to do what no enemy had ever done, bring war to the heart of Italy. The spark came in the form of Saguntum. Saguntum was a wealthy city on the eastern coast of Iberia, south of the Ebro River. Though technically outside the boundaries of the treaty that Rome had imposed on Carthage after the First Punic War, Saguntum had declared its allegiance to Rome. Hannibal saw it as a provocation, a deliberate encroachment on Carthaginian influence. Rome, for its part, viewed any attack on Saguntum as an attack on its honor. The situation was a powder keg, and Hannibal lit the fuse. The siege of Saguntum was brutal. For 8 months, Hannibal's forces battered the city with siege engines, towers, and relentless assaults. The defenders resisted fiercely, appealing in vain to Rome for intervention. But Rome hesitated, weighed down by politics and distance. When Saguntum finally fell, its walls reduced to rubble and its citizens slaughtered or enslaved, the message was clear: Hannibal would not be contained. Rome responded with fury, demanding Hannibal's surrender. Carthage, though divided internally, refused to betray its rising star. And thus, in the year 218 BCE, the Second Punic War began. Hannibal, however, did not wait for Rome to come to him. In one of the most audacious moves in military history, he began preparations for an overland invasion of Italy, through the rugged terrain of southern Gaul, across the towering Alps, and into the Roman heartland. The plan was as daring as it was dangerous. No general had ever attempted such a march with a full army, including cavalry and even war elephants. The logistical nightmare was staggering: supply lines, unfamiliar terrain, hostile tribes, and the sheer altitude of the Alps. But Hannibal believed that boldness would be his greatest weapon. Before departing, he entrusted Iberia to his brother Hasdrubal, leaving behind garrisons to protect Carthaginian interests and ensure the continued flow of silver and manpower. Then, with a polyglot army of some 50,000 men, he set out northward, into the unknown. What followed would become legend. A journey of ice and fire, of avalanche and ambush. The Alps claimed thousands of his men and animals. The cold numbed limbs and hearts. Supplies dwindled. Local tribes attacked from cliffside passes. Yet Hannibal pressed on, inspiring his men with speeches, driving them forward with the sheer force of will. And when he emerged, gaunt, ragged, but unbroken, on the plains of northern Italy, Rome realized that its worst nightmare had materialized. The enemy was not at its borders. He was within them. Hannibal had arrived. Chapter 11, Hannibal in Italy. When Hannibal descended from the Alps into the northern plains of Italy, he was not merely an invader. He was an apparition, like a force of nature, unexpected and unstoppable, rising from the white jaws of winter to challenge the might of Rome on its own soil. No army had ever done what he had done. No general had ever dared such audacity. His passage through the mountains had cost him dearly. Nearly half his men were lost to snow, hunger, or attack. His elephants, those symbols of Eastern power and psychological warfare, had perished save for a few. Yet what emerged from the alpine mists was no beaten horde. It was a blade drawn, sharpened by adversity, and ready to carve its mark into history. The initial Roman response was confusion, then fury. Rome, though shaken, was no stranger to war. It was a society built on military discipline, civic duty, and an unshakable belief in its destiny to rule. But what Rome had never faced was a commander like Hannibal, a strategist who did not merely engage but dismantled, who studied terrain like scripture and turned every weakness into a weapon. The first clash came near the Ticino River in late 218 BCE. Hannibal's cavalry, led by his brother Mago and bolstered by nimble Numidian horsemen, routed the Roman advance guard. Shortly after, at the Battle of the Trebia, Hannibal lured the larger Roman force into a freezing, marshy trap. His soldiers, hidden in ambush, sprang upon the Roman flanks as they crossed the river, soaked and shivering. The result was a massacre. Roman legionaries fell by the thousands. The survivors fled in chaos, their confidence shattered. And yet, Hannibal was only beginning. Spring brought new campaigns, new cities, new alliances. He crossed the Apennines and moved south, his every maneuver designed to fracture Roman control. The land itself seemed to aid him, he knew how to turn swamps into shields, mountains into fortresses, rivers into traps. But his true masterstroke came in 217 BCE, at the Battle of Lake Trasimene. Rome, eager to destroy him, sent the impetuous consul Gaius Flaminius in pursuit. Hannibal, aware of Flaminius' arrogance, baited him toward the lake's misty shores. There, he orchestrated a trap of breathtaking precision. His troops concealed in the hills descended in a synchronized onslaught. The Roman army, hemmed between the lake and the slopes, had no room to maneuver. The battle was a slaughter. Over 15,000 Romans were killed. The rest drowned or were captured. It was one of the largest ambushes in military history, and Hannibal's legend grew like wildfire. Panic seized Rome. Citizens feared he would march straight into the capital. The Senate appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, to save the republic. But Fabius, wary of Hannibal's cunning, refused to fight him directly. Instead, he adopted a policy of attrition, shadowing Hannibal's movements, cutting off supplies, burning crops. This cautious strategy earned Fabius the scorn of the public, who called him cunctator, the delayer. But in truth, it was the first Roman approach to cause Hannibal pause. He could not lure Fabius into battle, and though he ravaged the countryside, the Roman spirit endured. Hannibal needed more than victories. He needed a revolution, a wave of defections from Rome's Italian allies, who might see him not as a foreign invader but as a liberator. His greatest chance to ignite that spark came in 216 BCE, at a place called Cannae. The Roman Senate, impatient with Fabian delays, raised the largest army in its history, over 80,000 men, to confront Hannibal. Confident in numbers, they believed brute force would crush the Punic menace once and for all. But Hannibal had studied them. He had chosen the battlefield himself, a flat, open plain near the sea where his cavalry could maneuver freely. What unfolded was a masterpiece of tactical brilliance. Hannibal deployed his men in a crescent formation, placing his most vulnerable infantry, mostly Iberians and Gauls, at the center. Behind them, he held his strongest African veterans in reserve. As the Roman legions surged forward, they pushed back the center as expected, pressing inward with relentless momentum. But Hannibal allowed it. He let them believe they were winning. Then, as the Roman forces became tightly packed in the center, his flanks, African troops held in disciplined readiness, closed around them. Meanwhile, his cavalry, having driven off the Roman horsemen, wheeled behind and struck the Roman rear. The result was an encirclement so complete, so devastating, that it would be studied by generals for millennia. Trapped and compressed, the Roman soldiers were cut down without mercy. The Tiber ran red for days. Estimates suggest between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans died at Cannae, including a third of the entire Senate's eligible military class. It was the bloodiest single day in Roman history. Rome trembled. Allied cities began to defect, Capua, Tarentum, parts of Samnium. Some believed the Republic would collapse. Yet, in one of history's most extraordinary acts of political resilience, Rome refused to surrender. No envoys were sent to Hannibal. No peace was sought. Instead, the city steeled itself. Recruitment age was lowered. Slaves were offered freedom to enlist. Citizens donated their wealth to rebuild lost legions. Rome would fight to the end. And Hannibal? He made camp in southern Italy, hoping the cracks in Rome's alliance system would widen into fractures. But not all the allies turned. Some remained loyal, fearful of Carthaginian vengeance or skeptical of Hannibal's promises. Crucially, Rome still controlled the seas, cutting Hannibal off from reinforcements. His strategy depended on shattering the Italian coalition, but Rome, battered and bloodied, refused to break. Years passed. Hannibal remained in Italy, winning skirmishes, burning fields, but unable to take Rome itself. His army, once mighty, began to erode, replacements dwindled, supplies ran thin, and the dream of a final blow slipped further away. Meanwhile, a new Roman generation was rising, learning from failure, adapting to Hannibal's genius. Among them was a young general who would one day bring the war to Carthage's doorstep, Publius Cornelius Scipio. But in these early years, Hannibal reigned. His name was terror. Roman mothers silenced children with it. His tactics were studied even as they were suffered. Though stranded in enemy territory, he turned every village into a statement, every campaign into a chessboard. He marched through Italy not like a fugitive, but like a dark star, burning, brilliant, and unchallenged. And yet, brilliance can blaze too long. Hannibal, master of the impossible, was learning that even legends must contend with time, with attrition, and with an enemy that refused to die. Chapter 12: The Long War and the Turning Tide. Hannibal's early years in Italy were a string of victories so profound that they stunned not only Rome but the wider Mediterranean world. His tactics at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae were taught by future generations of generals as paragons of strategy, and his daring invasion of the Italian peninsula would echo through the ages. But as the years passed, the brilliance of those triumphs began to dull under the weight of strategic stalemate. The war had become long, grinding, and uncertain. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the tide began to turn. Rome, humbled but unbroken, evolved. The death tolls of Cannae had not defeated the Republic, they had transformed it. Out of trauma emerged a Rome more disciplined, more adaptive, and more relentless. The Romans abandoned the catastrophic direct confrontations that had allowed Hannibal to outwit them. Instead, they adopted attrition, refusing to give battle on his terms. They harassed his supply lines, fortified cities, and punished defecting allies with ruthless reprisals. They avoided set-piece battles and bled Hannibal in 1,000 smaller wounds. Hannibal remained in Italy for over a decade, but the nature of his campaign changed. He continued to win engagements and raid the countryside, but the political breakthrough he needed, mass defections from Rome's allied states, never fully materialized. Rome's iron grip on its alliance network, its harsh but consistent treatment of rebellious cities, and its unmatched ability to replenish lost armies ensured that the core of Italy remained under its sway. Moreover, Hannibal's supply lines became more tenuous with each passing year. The Carthaginian navy, battered after the First Punic War, was no longer capable of consistently reinforcing his position. The Roman fleet controlled the western seas, choking off reinforcements and isolating him from direct support from Carthage. His brother Hasdrubal, who had remained in Iberia to hold that vital region, eventually attempted to join him by marching his own army over the Alps in 207 BCE, an echo of Hannibal's own legendary feat, but the Romans intercepted Hasdrubal at the Battle of the Metaurus. There, Hasdrubal was defeated and killed, his head thrown into Hannibal's camp as a brutal message. Help was not coming. This moment marked the beginning of the end. Without reinforcements, with a dwindling force increasingly composed of weary veterans and unreliable locals, and with Rome pressing on all fronts, Hannibal's position became untenable. Yet he refused to retreat. His pride, his purpose, and his oath bound him to the Italian soil he had soaked in Roman blood. While Hannibal fought his holding action in the south, Rome pivoted. Under a new generation of commanders, the Republic took the war back to the Carthaginian sphere of influence. Nowhere was this more impactful than in Iberia, where the young general Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of a slain Roman consul, launched a brilliant campaign to sever Carthage's hold on the peninsula. Scipio was no ordinary Roman commander. He was a student of Hannibal's methods, innovative, daring, and unbound by rigid Roman tradition. In 209 BCE, he struck a decisive blow by capturing Carthago Nova, the Carthaginian stronghold in Iberia. It was a lightning assault, audacious and perfectly timed, that gave Rome control over a critical harbor, vast silver mines, and a treasure trove of military supplies. More importantly, it cut off Carthage's financial artery. One by one, the Spanish tribes shifted their loyalty. Scipio treated them with dignity and practiced a form of clemency rare in Roman policy. He was not only conquering territory, he was dismantling Carthage's network of alliances. Over the next few years, his campaigns drove the remaining Carthaginian forces out of the Iberian Peninsula entirely. By 206 BCE, Iberia was lost to Carthage, and Rome held the wealth and warriors that had once fueled Hannibal's campaigns. At home, Carthage was crumbling under pressure. Its Senate, ever fractious and dominated by mercantile factions wary of long foreign wars, hesitated to fully support Hannibal. Internal disputes, supply shortages, and the constant fear of rebellion among African subjects weakened the city's ability to project power. Carthage had once been the master of the seas, the queen of trade, the builder of mighty fleets. Now, it was a city fighting for its survival, stretched thin across multiple theaters of war. It was in this context that Scipio proposed the unthinkable, to invade North Africa itself. His logic was as sound as it was bold. Hannibal had to be drawn out of Italy. Carthage could not be defeated as long as its greatest general remained entrenched on Roman soil. But if Rome could threaten Carthage directly, the Senate would have no choice but to recall him. Scipio believed that the only way to beat Hannibal was to uproot him. After securing his command with some political maneuvering and promises of reinforcements, Scipio crossed into Africa in 204 BCE. He allied with Numidian princes, especially Massinissa, a shrewd and ambitious leader who had previously fought for Carthage but now sought power of his own. The alliance with Numidia gave Rome access to devastating cavalry, light, fast, and lethal on open terrain. Scipio then began a systematic campaign of pressure against Carthage's holdings, defeating its armies in North Africa and threatening its very gates. Faced with this existential crisis, the Carthaginian Senate had no choice but to summon Hannibal. After 16 years in Italy, he boarded a ship and returned home, not as a conqueror, but as a last hope. His departure marked the symbolic end of Carthage's ambitions in Italy. The dream of defeating Rome on its own ground was over. The war would now be decided not in Latium, but on the plains of Zama. In his homeland, Hannibal found a city changed. The populace revered him, but their faith was laced with desperation. The treasury was depleted. The armies were scattered. The nobles argued over every decision. Yet despite all this, Hannibal set to work. He raised a new army. Composed of local Carthaginians, veteran African troops, fresh levies, and war elephants, which had once symbolized his unstoppable march through the Alps. He knew this would be his final battle. One last throw of the dice. The final act was approaching. Chapter 13, The Battle of Zama. The fields of Zama, in the heart of North Africa, were quiet on the morning that would decide the fate of two empires. On one side stood Hannibal Barca, the greatest general Carthage had ever known. A man who had spent nearly 2 decades waging war on Roman soil, who had once brought the mighty republic to the edge of ruin. On the other side stood Publius Cornelius Scipio, a rising Roman star whose victories in Iberia and Africa had reshaped the balance of the Mediterranean. Their armies had marched across continents. Their nations had sacrificed generations. Now, everything would be decided by a single confrontation. It was October, 202 BCE. Both generals understood the stakes. If Carthage won, it might reclaim lost territory, renegotiate peace, and preserve its dignity as a Mediterranean power. If Rome won, it would reduce Carthage to a vassal, strip it of its empire, and declare itself the unquestioned master of the Western world. Hannibal's army, freshly assembled upon his return from Italy, was a patchwork of experience and uncertainty. His core force included some of the veterans who had survived the long Italian campaign, battle-hardened and loyal. He supplemented them with newly conscripted Carthaginian citizens, mercenaries from the Numidian and Libyan interior, and his last remaining elephants, about 80 in number, intended to strike fear into the Roman ranks as they had in years past. But this was not the force he had once commanded. Many of his Iberian veterans were dead. His cavalry, once swift and decisive, was now inferior to Rome's. And worse, the Numidian prince Massinissa, formerly Carthage's ally, had turned to Rome and brought with him a formidable cavalry contingent. The tide of fortune, which had once favored Hannibal, now swelled against him. Scipio's army, by contrast, was fresh and disciplined. Veterans of the Iberian campaigns stood shoulder to shoulder with new Roman recruits. His legions were drilled in the latest tactics and supported by thousands of Numidian horsemen under Massinissa's command. Scipio, ever the student of Hannibal, had studied his opponent's past maneuvers and prepared meticulously for every possibility. On the day of battle, Hannibal deployed his army in traditional Carthaginian formation, 3 lines of infantry arranged in staggered depth. In the front stood the mercenaries and irregulars, behind them, the more reliable citizen troops, and in the rear, the hardened veterans from Italy, his last and most trusted blade. His elephants were positioned in front, ready to charge at Scipio's lines. Scipio, anticipating this, arranged his legions in open columns with wide corridors between units. When the elephants charged, the Roman soldiers parted like water, allowing the beasts to pass harmlessly down the lanes. Some were diverted entirely by skirmishers and noise. Others panicked and turned back into their own ranks, creating chaos in the Carthaginian lines. The psychological weapon had failed. With the initial shock neutralized, the battle turned into a clash of infantry. Hannibal's front lines engaged first but were poorly coordinated and poorly motivated. As they faltered, his second line was forced to advance over their fallen comrades. Discipline broke down. Only when Hannibal's veterans entered the fray did the true contest begin. These men, who had marched with him through Gaul, crossed the Alps, and faced down Rome on the plains of Italy, fought like lions. They pushed back the Roman center, gaining ground and momentum. But Scipio, calm and calculating, regrouped. He rotated his exhausted front ranks with reserves and used his superior cavalry, now returning from routing the Carthaginian horsemen, to strike the enemy's rear. Trapped between Roman infantry and a sudden cavalry pincer, Hannibal's veterans were surrounded. The battle degenerated into slaughter. There was no escape. No retreat. Only silence and death. By day's end, the field of Zama was strewn with Carthaginian bodies. As many as 20,000 men were killed. Another 20,000 were captured. Hannibal escaped the field with his life, but not his dream. For the first time in his career, he had been utterly defeated. Scipio, now hailed as Scipio Africanus, had delivered the final blow in the Second Punic War. But his victory was not merely military, it was civilizational. Rome had destroyed not just an army, but the myth of Carthaginian invincibility. The terror of Hannibal, which had haunted Italy for 16 years, had been banished by steel and strategy. Carthage, shattered and humiliated, sued for peace. The terms imposed by Rome were crushing. Carthage was stripped of all overseas territories, no more Iberia, no more islands. Its navy was reduced to 10 ships. It was forbidden from waging war without Roman permission. It was forced to pay a massive indemnity, 10,000 talents of silver over 50 years. And it had to recognize Massinissa as king of Numidia, surrendering vast tracts of African land to his rule. The Carthaginian Empire, as it had existed, was gone. But what lingered was bitterness. The war had destroyed Carthage's economic base, undermined its political structures, and left its citizens impoverished. Yet its spirit, its culture, its intellect, and its hatred of Rome, endured. Hannibal, still beloved by the people, would attempt to reform the state, rooting out corruption and strengthening the city's administration. But Rome, ever wary, never forgot his name. Eventually, pressure from Rome would force him into exile, beginning a tragic journey that would take him from the courts of the Hellenistic East to a lonely death far from home. The Battle of Zama marked more than a Roman victory. It marked the end of an age. Carthage, the great merchant power, the mistress of the seas, the city of Baal and Tanit, had fallen from imperial majesty to humbled vassal. The republic that had once dared to challenge Rome on its own soil was now a client in all but name. But Carthage would not be forgotten. And in Rome, whispers of its legacy would never fully fade. The war had ended, but the rivalry had not. For some in Rome, the existence of Carthage, even in chains, was an insult. One day, a voice would rise from the Senate halls, demanding not peace, not balance, but annihilation. Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. That day, too, would come. Chapter 14, The Ghost of Carthage. In the quiet years that followed the Battle of Zama, Carthage lived not as an empire, but as a ghost, a once proud dominion reduced to tribute and humiliation. Its ships, once the finest in the Mediterranean, were docked and rotting, their masts stripped of glory. Its warriors, once feared across the seas, were disarmed. The city's famed harbors, those twin marvels of Punic engineering, echoed with silence rather than commerce. Carthage still stood, but she no longer ruled. And though the fires of conquest had dimmed, the embers of identity still glowed beneath the ashes. The peace treaty imposed by Rome was designed not only to cripple but to control. Carthage had been stripped of her empire. Iberia lost, Sardinia long gone, the seas no longer hers to command. She was permitted no foreign wars and no independent diplomacy. If Carthage so much as raised arms in defense, she was expected to ask Rome for permission. The very thought was galling to a people whose ancestors had once commanded fleets, dictated treaties, and measured time by trade winds. And yet, in this state of shackled survival, Carthage began to rebuild. Slowly, quietly, stubbornly. The economic instincts that had always defined the city, craft, commerce, and cunning, began to reassert themselves. Denied the sword, the Carthaginians turned again to the coin. The city became a hub of finance and agriculture. Her merchants, banned from expansion, turned their focus inward, improving irrigation, refining trade routes within Africa, and creating new ventures that operated just within the limits of Roman tolerance. Farmlands that had been scorched during the war with Scipio were replanted. Silver no longer poured from Iberian mines, but new industries grew in their place: dye production, textiles, and refined olive oils. Carthage was not dead, it was adapting. Central to this quiet renaissance was Hannibal himself. Far from vanishing after Zama, the general returned to the city a changed man. He knew the war had been lost not merely on the battlefield, but in Carthage's own senate. An institution riddled with self-interest, corruption, and fear. Hannibal, despite his military fame, had always harbored ambitions beyond war. He now turned his formidable intellect toward governance. As Safit, or chief magistrate, a position equivalent to a consul, Hannibal instituted sweeping reforms. He rooted out corruption in the tax system, reduced the power of the oligarchic elite, and ensured that Carthage met its Roman indemnity payments ahead of schedule, demonstrating financial strength and civic discipline. These efforts earned him the admiration of the people and the suspicion of the aristocracy. But above all, they terrified Rome. For in Hannibal's reformed Carthage, the Senate of Rome saw not obedience, but resilience. A city that had paid its dues early was not a city crushed. It was a city recovering. Rome had won the war, but Carthage, impossibly, was thriving again. Her wealth was returning. Her people were confident. And her greatest son still lived. Fearing the long shadow of Hannibal, Rome demanded his exile. Carthage, still under treaty and unable to defy Roman will, acquiesced. In silence and sorrow, Hannibal fled the city he had bled for. Thus began his years in exile. Drifting from court to court in the Hellenistic world, always seeking a way to oppose Rome, always watched by Roman agents. He offered advice to Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, urging the Eastern king to challenge Roman supremacy. But Antiochus, cautious and conventional, failed to wield Hannibal's insights effectively. Defeat followed. Hannibal moved on. His last years were spent as an eternal wanderer, a soldier without a battlefield, a patriot without a state. He wrote, counseled, studied. And when Roman pressure finally made his position untenable, Hannibal chose death over capture. In a distant Anatolian village, he drank poison. According to legend, his last words were bitterly simple: "Let us relieve the Romans from their fear of a tired old man." With Hannibal's death, a chapter closed. Yet Rome had not rid itself of Carthage. In the following decades, Carthage continued to prosper economically, much to the discomfort of the Roman elite. Senators and generals watched with unease as the city's ports grew busy again, its treasury swelled, and its citizens began to speak once more with confidence. Rome's allies in North Africa, particularly Massinissa of Numidia, now a client king, repeatedly clashed with Carthaginian border settlements. Carthage, bound by treaty, could not retaliate militarily. Instead, it sent envoys to Rome, begging for justice. But the appeals fell on deaf ears. Rome no longer saw Carthage as a threat, but as an affront, a city that had dared to rise again. Voices in the Senate began to speak more openly of a final reckoning. Chief among them was the famed orator Cato the Elder, who ended every speech, no matter its topic, with the same refrain: Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. This was no longer policy. It was obsession. Carthage, for all her efforts to coexist, found herself once again caught between resistance and submission. She had rebuilt her society, cultivated trade, obeyed Roman orders, and still the noose tightened. Each year, Roman suspicion grew. Each year, Numidian raids continued. And eventually, Carthage did what any sovereign city might: it defended itself. This, Rome declared, was a breach of the treaty. Not just an error, but a casus belli. It was all the Senate had been waiting for. In 149 BCE, 50 years after the end of the Second Punic War, Rome declared war on Carthage again. But this would not be a war of armies in open field. This would not be a contest of generals or tactics. This would be annihilation. Chapter 15, The Third Punic War. The Roman Republic did not go to war with Carthage in 149 BCE out of fear, nor even out of necessity. It went to war out of principle, Rome's principle that Carthage, no matter how compliant, could never be trusted, and that its mere existence was an insult to Roman dominion. What began as political pressure and posturing soon took on the character of a holy crusade. Carthage had become, in Roman eyes, a ghost that haunted their dreams of eternal supremacy. And like all ghosts, it had to be exorcised, utterly, completely, and forever. The war that followed, known to history as the Third Punic War, was not a grand campaign of strategy like the first, nor an epic duel of genius like the second. It was a cold, calculated siege. The deliberate crushing of a city by a republic determined to erase it. The causes were dressed in legal language, that Carthage had broken its treaty by defending itself against Numidian aggression. But everyone understood the truth. Rome had waited for an excuse. And now it had one. At first, Carthage tried diplomacy. She offered hostages, noble children, sons of her leading families. She surrendered weapons, even dismantled her navy. But when Roman envoys issued their final demand, that the entire city of Carthage be evacuated and destroyed, and its people relocated inland, away from the sea that had defined them, something snapped. The mask of submission fell. The Carthaginians, humiliated, enraged, and faced with extinction, refused. The city would not go quietly. And so, Carthage prepared for war, its last. With no standing army and stripped of most resources, the citizens themselves took up arms. Every forge in the city was turned into a weapons factory. Women cut their hair to make ropes for siege machines. Children carried stones for ramparts. Temples became arsenals. Slaves were freed and armed. The city, encircled by its famous triple walls and harbors, became a fortress of desperation and defiance. The Romans, under consular leadership, laid siege to Carthage. But they had underestimated the will of a people fighting for survival. The initial assaults failed. The Carthaginians hurled back the legions with burning oil, poison darts, and rooftop ambushes. For nearly 2 years, the siege dragged on. Disease and desert winds tormented both sides. Rome rotated its generals in frustration. Until the Senate finally appointed Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption of Scipio Africanus, the conqueror of Hannibal. Scipio the Younger was not merely competent, he was relentless. Upon assuming command, he reorganized the Roman forces, cut off the last supply lines into the city, and tightened the noose. Starvation began to set in. Carthaginian families ground grain dust into paste. Corpses lined the streets. Yet still, the city would not yield. In the spring of 146 BCE, Scipio ordered the final assault. The Romans breached the harbor district first, fighting block by block, house by house. Carthaginian resistance was fanatical. Men fought on rooftops, in alleyways, from behind fallen columns. Families burned their own homes rather than surrender. Temple sanctuaries became strongholds of last resistance. The Romans advanced inch by inch, their sandals soaked in blood, their shields dented by the fury of a doomed people. After 6 days of street fighting, Carthage fell. What followed was not victory, it was obliteration. Scipio allowed the city to be looted. The remaining population, estimated at around 50,000 survivors from perhaps hundreds of thousands, was sold into slavery. The rest had perished, through combat, disease, fire, or starvation. Carthage's libraries were destroyed. Her temples desecrated. Her walls torn down stone by stone. Her harbors filled with rubble. According to legend, the land was salted to ensure that nothing would grow again, though this story, while powerful, is likely apocryphal. Scipio stood amidst the ruins. Ancient sources say he wept, not out of sympathy, but out of dread. For in Carthage's fate, he glimpsed a dark future for Rome. All great cities fall. Even this one. The Senate declared the territory of Carthage now a Roman province, Africa, the first step in what would become a continental empire. The name survived. But the city, as it had been, was no more. Carthage, mother of Hannibal, jewel of the Punic world, merchant queen of the western seas, was gone. Chapter 16, Aftermath and Roman Africa. In the silence that followed the fall of Carthage, an ancient world ended. The fires that had consumed her temples smoldered long after the screams had faded. No longer did ships crowd her harbors, no longer did merchants bargain in her markets. What had once been a center of power, wealth, and learning, a rival to Rome itself, was now rubble under Roman boots. The Third Punic War was over, but what remained was something new and terrible, the triumph of a singular power over an entire civilization. The Mediterranean would never be the same again. Rome wasted no time asserting its authority over the smoldering remains. The land once belonging to the Carthaginian Empire was annexed and organized as the province of Africa Proconsularis. Administrators, settlers, and soldiers arrived from Italy, planting the Roman flag in the heart of North Africa. The rich agricultural land that had once fed Carthage's people was now seized for Roman estates. Olive groves and grain fields were handed over to Latin landowners. Latin became the language of power. Roman law supplanted Punic tradition. But for all its brutality, Rome was not merely destructive, it was systematic. Roads were built. Aqueducts were laid. Latin colonies were founded in the hinterlands. A new order took shape on the bones of the old. Yet the memory of Carthage, like a ghost, lingered in every olive branch, in every ruined port. Though her walls had fallen, her shadow was not so easily erased. The Punic people, those who had not perished or been enslaved, remained, scattered across North Africa in coastal towns and inland villages. Some clung to old customs, speaking the Punic tongue and honoring Baal and Tanit in hidden rites. Others assimilated, adopting Roman dress, Roman names, and Roman gods. Over time, the Punic identity did not vanish, it adapted, evolving in the margins of empire, whispering in the gaps between Latin lines. Even in death, Carthage's legacy survived. Curiously, Carthage's rebirth would come not from Rome's enemies, but from Rome itself. A century after its destruction, in 46 BCE, Julius Caesar, dictator and reformer, visited the site of the old city. What he found, according to legend, disturbed him, a city-shaped void, where once there had been splendor. Caesar, ever conscious of legacy and destiny, ordered a new city to be built on the ruins. This was not an act of mercy, but one of empire. Rome would claim Carthage not only in death, but in rebirth, as a Roman city, Roman in stone, but Punic in soil. The new Colonia Julia Carthago quickly rose as one of the most important cities in Roman Africa. Located on the same strategic promontory, with access to fertile hinterlands and Mediterranean trade routes, Roman Carthage became a hub of commerce, agriculture, and culture once more. Magnificent buildings were erected, baths, forums, theaters, villas. The city's Roman population grew, and with it came scholars, poets, magistrates, and merchants. Its port bustled again, not with the sails of Punic triremes, but with Roman merchantmen. Roman Carthage would become the capital of the province, second only to Alexandria as the wealthiest city in Africa. Temples to Jupiter replaced the shrines to Baal, and Latin inscriptions replaced Punic graffiti. Yet underneath this Roman veneer, the land remembered. Excavations centuries later would reveal Punic tombs beneath Roman villas. Statues of Roman emperors were sometimes carved on reused Punic stones. The past had not been entirely erased, only paved over. As Rome transitioned into empire, Africa Proconsularis became one of its most vital provinces. The region supplied Rome with vast quantities of grain, olive oil, and other goods. North African cities like Utica, Leptis Magna, and Thuga flourished under Roman patronage. The former heartland of the Carthaginian Empire was now a breadbasket of Rome. Ironically, in this role, Carthage fulfilled a destiny it had once fought to avoid. It became the servant of Rome, not its equal. Yet even as Rome celebrated its dominion, even as the empire reached its zenith, whispers of Carthage's greatness persisted. Roman historians like Livy and Polybius, though victors in the narrative, could not help but admire the city they had vanquished. Hannibal was remembered not merely as a villain, but as a genius. The Punic Wars were immortalized as struggles between two titans, one triumphant, the other tragic. In time, as Rome herself began to decline, some philosophers would reflect on Carthage not as a defeated enemy, but as a warning. Arrogance, some said, had led Rome to destroy a rival so thoroughly that it lost a mirror of its own ambition. Others saw Carthage as proof of the cruelty baked into empire, how greatness can be buried under the weight of envy, how civilizations fall not just by swords, but by silence imposed upon them. In the centuries to come, Christianity would rise across Roman Africa. Carthage, surprisingly, became one of its early centers. Saints and bishops walked the same streets where soldiers once clashed. One of the most influential early Christian thinkers, Saint Augustine, was born in nearby Hippo Regius and received his education in Roman Carthage. Thus, the soil of Carthage, which had once nurtured pagan merchants and warriors, now fed the roots of a new faith. And then, as Rome itself fractured and faded, Carthage was taken again, this time by the Vandals, then later by the Byzantines, and eventually by the Arabs. But by then, the Punic spirit had faded into memory, absorbed by centuries of conquest and conversion. Still, the ruins remained. And in the stones, in the winds that blew through broken columns, in the harbor's gentle lapping, the echo of Carthage lingered, like a melody remembered by the sea. Chapter 17, The Legacy of Carthage. Carthage, though razed and repurposed, did not vanish from the world. Its name, its legend, and its influence seeped into the very foundations of the Mediterranean's history and culture. While its temples burned and its warriors were silenced, Carthage lived on in stories, in stone, in the very memories of its conquerors. Great civilizations leave legacies not just through victory, but through the indelible imprint they leave on the conscience of the world. And Carthage, defiant to the end, etched itself deep into the soul of history. What had Carthage been, in truth? A city of traders and warriors, of brilliant engineers and seafarers, of philosophers and priests. It had been a crucible of cultural fusion, Phoenician in origin, African in context, Mediterranean in reach. From its earliest days, it had thrived not by conquest alone, but by commerce, negotiation, and adaptability. Its harbors had welcomed ships from as far as Iberia and Egypt. Its merchants had spread Punic goods and language across 3 continents. In this, Carthage had rivaled even the Hellenistic kingdoms, carving out a sphere of influence without the need for myths of divine right or imperial manifestos. It had been a republic before Rome had ever dreamed of a senate. But the story of Carthage was also the story of rivalry, of 2 great powers rising at the same time, with overlapping ambitions. The Punic Wars were not mere accidents of politics. They were the inevitable clash of 2 expanding worlds. Carthage and Rome were mirror images, both mercantile, both militaristic, both fiercely independent and stubbornly proud. In the end, one had to fall for the other to reign. The destruction of Carthage marked the moment when Rome ceased to be merely an Italian hegemon and became an imperial power. It was a psychological turning point as much as a geopolitical one. In razing Carthage, Rome confirmed its own sense of destiny. That it was the chosen master of the known world. The republic's expansion accelerated. Provinces multiplied. Legions marched further than ever before. And always, behind this momentum, there was the ghost of Carthage, the proof that Rome had the will to destroy utterly. Yet in conquering Carthage, Rome also absorbed parts of it. The Punic navy, admired even by Roman commanders, influenced naval designs in the later Republic and Empire. Carthaginian agricultural manuals, meticulous and scientific, were studied by Roman landowners and philosophers, particularly the work of Mago, a Carthaginian agronomist whose volumes were translated into Latin and Greek. Punic architectural styles appeared in Roman North Africa, blending with imperial forms to create something unique to the region. Even the idea of Roman Carthage, rebuilt by Caesar and later expanded by Augustus, was not a complete erasure, but a transformation. The city became a crossroads again. This time of Roman Africa. Latinized Punic elites held civic positions. African grain fed the legions. In the amphitheaters of Roman Carthage, gladiators fought for sport, watched by crowds unaware that the dust beneath their sandals once drank the blood of heroes. And yet, the legacy of Carthage was not only structural or economic, it was also deeply philosophical. Historians, even in antiquity, debated the morality of its destruction. Polybius, though Greek and a guest of Roman patrons, expressed ambivalence. He had walked the ruins with Scipio Aemilianus and recorded the general's haunting realization that what happened to Carthage could, in time, happen to Rome. Livy, writing generations later, portrayed the Punic Wars as the defining moral crucible of the Roman character, yet could not avoid admiring Hannibal's genius. Hannibal, in particular, became the embodiment of Carthage's undying mystique. Roman generals admired him even as they feared him. Military academies centuries later would study his campaigns as models of boldness, ingenuity, and daring. His name lived on, carved into the minds of strategists from Napoleon Bonaparte to Dwight Eisenhower. The Alps would never again be seen as just mountains. They were Hannibal's stage. His legacy outlived his nation. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Carthage's legacy was its symbolism. It became, in time, a metaphor for resilience. And for tragedy. Its rise illustrated the heights a civilization could reach without imperial dogma. Its fall, a warning of what happens when fear and pride overtake diplomacy. Carthage became a cautionary tale not just about warfare, but about hatred. Rome had not needed to destroy Carthage. It had chosen to. That choice would forever haunt the narrative of the Republic. In modern times, Carthage's memory has been reclaimed. Archaeologists began uncovering the city's ruins in the 19th and 20th centuries, revealing temples, homes, artifacts, and inscriptions that told stories long buried beneath Roman concrete. Museums now hold its jewelry, its pottery, its delicate glasswork. Punic script, once forgotten, has been partially deciphered. Historians now explore Carthage not merely as Rome's adversary, but as a civilization in its own right, with its own innovations, arts, beliefs, and dignity. Carthage, long portrayed as the villain in Roman epics, is being understood anew, as a victim of geopolitical paranoia, as a cultural beacon in antiquity, and as a city whose soul, though shattered, never truly died. It survives in memory, in ruins, in the sea winds that still blow across the Gulf of Tunis. And in that survival, it defies its conquerors. For though Rome reduced Carthage to ashes, it could never erase its essence. Carthage was not merely destroyed. It was remembered. Chapter 18, Faith, Culture, and the Punic Soul. Though the mighty fleets were long gone and the war cries of Hannibal's legions had faded into history, the essence of Carthage endured, not through empire or conquest, but through faith, memory, and cultural transmission. The Punic people, descendants of the seafaring Phoenicians, had planted deep roots in North Africa. And even as Rome buried their cities and scattered their gods, the soul of Carthage, its ideas, its beliefs, its worldview, continued to echo through the centuries. Carthaginian religion had always stood apart from the polytheistic pantheons of Greece and Rome. While those cultures envisioned their gods in human forms, with human follies, the Punic spiritual tradition was darker, older, and more elemental. At its core were two deities, Baal-Hamon, the weathered god of storms, time, and kingship, and Tanit, the serene goddess of fertility, life, and protection. These were not comforting gods. They were powerful, demanding, and mysterious. Their worship reflected a culture forged in the crucible of trade and survival, a culture where nature's bounty and fury were both sacred. Baal-Hamon, often depicted with a long beard and raised hand, symbolized the implacable forces of fate and time. He was the god to whom rulers turned in times of war, drought, and plague. Tanit, by contrast, was the gentler hand, often represented by a stylized symbol of a triangle atop a crescent. A form both elegant and enigmatic. She was the protector of the city, the guardian of life, the mother of renewal. Together, they formed the spiritual dyad of Carthage, a union of strength and mercy. Much has been made, and debated, about the more controversial aspects of Punic religious practice, particularly the alleged ritual sacrifice of children. Ancient sources, especially Greek and Roman writers like Diodorus and Plutarch, describe in horrified tones how Carthaginians offered infants to Baal-Hamon in times of crisis, burning them in great bronze furnaces to appease divine wrath. Archaeological evidence from Tophets, sacred open-air burial grounds, has revealed thousands of small urns containing the charred remains of children and animals, sparking fierce scholarly debate. Some historians argue that these were indeed sacrificial victims, pointing to inscriptions and the context of the remains. Others suggest the Tophets were cemeteries for children who had died of natural causes, whose remains were given special religious treatment due to the fragility of life in ancient times. The truth may lie somewhere in between, lost to time, but what is clear is that Carthaginian religion reflected a society that viewed life and death in deeply symbolic, deeply spiritual terms. Whether sacrifice or mourning, the Tophet reveals a culture that never viewed death as an end, but rather as an offering, a passage, a sacred transition. With the destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE, its temples were torn down, its rites outlawed. Roman religion moved in, with its familiar pantheon of Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and Juno. Latin prayers replaced Punic hymns. Yet not all was erased. In rural areas and among the surviving Punic populations, old practices persisted, sometimes secretly, sometimes syncretically, woven into the fabric of Roman life. One of the most enduring examples of this cultural resilience was in language. The Punic tongue, a Western Semitic language closely related to Phoenician and Hebrew, survived for centuries after Carthage's fall. It was spoken in homes, whispered in marketplaces, and etched onto tombs. Even Saint Augustine, writing in the 4th century CE, noted that Punic was still widely spoken in the North African countryside. It was a sign that while the city had been physically destroyed, the people who had built it, and the identity they carried, remained intact beneath the surface of Roman rule. Indeed, Carthage played an essential role in the spread of Christianity in North Africa. By the 2nd century CE, the Roman city of Carthage had become a hub of theological thought. Some of the earliest Christian martyrs hailed from the region, including Perpetua and Felicity, whose diaries and martyrdoms were preserved and read across the Roman world. Christianity in Africa developed in a unique way, shaped by its Roman overlay, but also by the cultural memory of Punic spirituality. Perhaps the most influential Christian thinker from the region was Saint Augustine of Hippo. Born in 354 CE in Tagaste, modern-day Algeria, Augustine was educated in Carthage, where he became a skilled rhetorician. Though he was ethnically Berber and culturally Roman, Augustine's philosophical roots grew from the intellectual soil once cultivated by the Carthaginians. His writings, the Confessions, City of God, and others, would become foundational to Christian theology and Western thought for centuries to come. Augustine was not alone. Carthage, under Roman and later Vandal rule, produced a rich Christian tradition, marked by passionate debates over doctrine, morality, and the nature of the divine. The Donatist movement, a North African Christian sect, challenged Rome's religious authority and became a defining schism in early Christianity. It was a testament to the region's enduring intellectual vitality and resistance to outside control. Echoes, perhaps, of the stubborn independence that had once defined Carthage herself. As centuries passed, Carthage's layers grew. After the Romans came the Vandals, Germanic warriors who seized the city in the 5th century CE and made it the capital of their North African kingdom. They left behind a brief, chaotic imprint before being ousted by the Byzantine Empire, which restored Carthage as an imperial city under Emperor Justinian. But even this was not to last. In 698 CE, during the rapid expansion of Islam, Arab armies captured Carthage. The city was sacked and permanently abandoned as a center of power. A new city, Tunis, rose nearby, destined to become the capital of Islamic North Africa. By the medieval period, Carthage was a memory. Its stones were looted for other buildings. Its temples and forums collapsed into dust. Yet travelers and chroniclers would still visit the site, walking among its ruins, marveling at the broken columns and silent streets, listening for the whispers of a once mighty empire. And in the libraries of Europe, copies of Livy and Polybius continued to tell the tale of Carthage, not as a footnote, but as a rival, a warning, and a lost world. In the end, Carthage's legacy was not just in the wars it fought or the generals it raised. It was in the strength of its culture, the depth of its faith, and the persistence of its identity. Through fire and ruin, conquest and exile, the Punic soul endured, sometimes as a whisper, sometimes as a flame. Carthage never returned to empire. But it never truly vanished, either. It remains in the memory of civilizations that followed: Rome, Byzantium, Islam, Christendom. Carthage is not only a city lost to time. It is a question still being asked. Chapter 19. Rediscovery and Archaeological Resurrection. For centuries after its final fall, Carthage lay buried beneath silence and stone. The fields where elephants had once charged and legions had once bled were overtaken by wild grass and forgotten trails. Time eroded its monuments. Sand choked its aqueducts. And yet, in the minds of scholars and dreamers, Carthage endured. The city that Rome tried to erase lived on in the pages of classical historians, in whispered legends, and in the endless human hunger to uncover what has been lost. The rediscovery of Carthage began in earnest during the Enlightenment and accelerated in the 19th and 20th centuries. With the rise of European colonial interests in North Africa, particularly by France, a renewed curiosity emerged about the ancient world buried beneath the modern Tunisian landscape. Carthage, long a symbol of antiquity's tragic grandeur, became a subject not of political fear but of intellectual fascination. In the 1830s and 1840s, the first serious attempts at archaeological exploration began. French scholars, following ancient texts and guided by local knowledge, identified the Bursa Hill, the sacred heart of Carthage, and began excavating. What they found shocked and inspired them. Beneath layers of Roman reconstruction and Byzantine rubble lay the bones of the Punic city, foundations of homes, fragments of walls, pottery painted with stylized Tanit symbols, and, most hauntingly, the Tophets, those open-air sanctuaries holding the tiny urns of children, sacrificed or buried with ritual. As the decades progressed, excavations expanded. The ruins revealed more than war and destruction, they spoke of life. Carthaginian artisans had created delicate jewelry, advanced metallurgy, and stunning mosaics. The city's water systems and urban planning showed a degree of engineering once attributed only to Greeks and Romans. Here was proof that Carthage had been not merely a military rival to Rome, but a peer in technology, organization, and culture. The archaeological work was not without controversy. Interpretations of the Tophet continued to stir debate. Did these urns confirm the grim Roman accusations of child sacrifice, or were they misunderstood burial sites for infants who had died naturally? The question persists today, reminding us that archaeology often raises as many questions as it answers. Still, the evidence grew: inscriptions in Punic script, votive offerings, statues of Baal Hammon, household items preserved by fire and sand. Among the most extraordinary finds were inscriptions, in both Punic and Neo-Punic, etched into stone and pottery, offering glimpses into daily life, contracts, temple dedications, and names. These texts were crucial in deciphering the Punic language, a task still ongoing. Although not as complete as Latin or Greek, Punic has been partially recovered, thanks to bilingual inscriptions and the careful comparison of symbols with their Phoenician origins. Carthage's harbor complex was another revelation. Ancient texts had described a marvel of maritime architecture. Two great harbors, one rectangular for trade, the other circular for the navy, with a central island surrounded by docking bays. For centuries, this was dismissed as exaggeration. But satellite imagery and underwater archaeology confirmed the shape and foundations of these structures, validating the accounts of ancient writers. Carthage had indeed commanded the sea with brilliance and precision. In the 20th century, especially during the era of French Tunisia, Carthage became both an archaeological treasure and a political symbol. Museums were built, sites preserved. The National Museum of Carthage, situated atop the Bursa Hill, began curating artifacts of Punic, Roman, and Christian Carthage, creating a tapestry of eras that once overlapped in stone and memory. Tourists, scholars, and dignitaries came to walk among the ruins, to see with their own eyes what once defied Rome. In 1979, Carthage's archaeological area was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, affirming its global importance. It was no longer just a Roman ruin or a footnote in the story of empire. It was recognized as a testament to a civilization that had shaped, resisted, and been reborn across the ages. Today, the modern suburb of Carthage, located just outside Tunis, blends modern villas with ancient ruins. Students walk past 2,000-year-old stones. Locals refer to Tanit in folklore. Historians from around the world gather to decipher Punic scripts and reconstruct ancient trade routes. Each excavation brings new surprises, more pieces of pottery, more remnants of the past, more reasons to remember. And yet, perhaps most important of all, is what the rediscovery of Carthage represents in human terms, the enduring will of memory. Carthage was meant to be erased. It was meant to vanish, forgotten under Roman roads and imperial silence. But it refused. It endured in legend, was preserved by sand, and rose again through scholarship. The story of Carthage's rediscovery is not just about artifacts or architecture, it is about redemption. It is about how a civilization, once silenced by conquest, can speak again through ruins, through inscriptions, through the eyes of a child gazing up at a statue of Baal or the bones of a Roman forum and wondering, who lived here? What did they dream? Carthage lives once more. Not in empires, but in questions, in memory, and in the hands of those who still seek to understand her. Chapter 20, Carthage Eternal. History often writes its stories with finality, with sharp endings and clear conclusions. But the tale of Carthage resists such closure. Though her walls were toppled and her people scattered, though Rome tried to consign her to oblivion, Carthage endures, not just in ruins and relics, but in the unbreakable thread of remembrance that binds past to present. She lives in the quiet persistence of a name whispered across millennia, in the reverence of scholars and the awe of travelers, and in the paradox of a city destroyed yet never fully lost. Carthage's story, in its full arc, is one of astonishing breadth and emotional weight. Born of Phoenician daring and maritime brilliance, she rose from a trading post on a distant coast to the heart of a Mediterranean empire. Her greatness was built not on brute force but on commerce, ingenuity, and adaptability. Carthage taught the world that prosperity could be shaped by ships as much as by swords, and that the rhythm of trade could rival the drumbeat of war. She stood as a challenge to Roman certainty, an equal, perhaps even a better in her time. And in the crucible of conflict, Carthage gave rise to one of the greatest military minds the world has ever known. Hannibal Barca, a name that still echoes in the halls of military academies, a commander whose audacity reshaped warfare itself. His march across the Alps was more than strategy, it was a cry of defiance, a testament to the bold spirit of a people who refused to kneel. But Carthage's legacy is not just martial. It is deeply human. It is seen in the economic networks she built across Africa, Spain, and the islands of the sea. In the graceful balance of Baal and Tanit, reflecting a cosmology of struggle and harmony. In the sailors who mapped new routes, in the artisans who crafted intricate works of gold and glass, in the children whose names were whispered to the stars in sacred rites. She was a city of belief, of resilience, of ambition, and ultimately, of profound suffering. When Rome decided that Carthage must die, it did so not out of necessity, but fear. Fear of what Carthage represented. An alternative to Roman hegemony, a civilization built on a different vision of power. And so they burned it. They tore it stone from stone. They sought to make the name vanish from the earth. But Carthage refused to disappear. Through the Roman colony that bore her name, through the Christian bishops who debated theology in her basilicas, through St. Augustine who studied in her streets, Carthage lingered. Through the rise of Islam and the flourishing of Arab civilization in North Africa, her bones were not forgotten. Through the pages of history books and the brushstrokes of archaeologists, she emerged once more. And in our time, she continues to rise, not in vengeance or grief, but in knowledge. Carthage now stands as a symbol not of defeat, but of endurance. She reminds us that no civilization is ever truly lost, that memory can outlive fire, and that in the dust of the past lie seeds of understanding. Her story is a mirror held up to all empires, to all dreams of dominance. It asks us, what will be remembered of us? what will survive our triumphs and failures? In the end, Carthage is not merely a cautionary tale or a relic of war. She is a beacon, a reminder that greatness often rises not from conquest, but from connection. That identity, once forged, can never be fully erased. That even when buried, the soul of a people speaks. So let us remember her not only as Rome's fallen rival, but as a civilization worthy of its own place in the pantheon of history. Let us walk among her ruins not with pity, but with reverence. And let us listen to the wind over Bursa Hill, where the voices of the past still whisper, not in sorrow, but in defiant song. Carthage eternal.